They noticed down the road where the Jews lived that the Jews weren't dying near as much. They followed an Old Testament book called Leviticus a little bit more strenuously than Christians ever did. And there are things about cleaning in Leviticus. They were cleaner, therefore they weren't dying of bubonic plague like so many other areas of Christians. So what did the Christians that were dying decide? The bubonic plague did some major damage to Europe in the 1300s, and I wanted to kind of give you a little background of how it got to Europe. And so what I have here on this map is a little city up here in northern Italy called Genoa. And then over here, underneath that red spot is called the Crimean Peninsula. It's in the news quite a lot because of Mr. Putin and his desires to have that area. So this is Genoa, and this is a little city called Caffa, C-A-F-F-A. Written it down there for you on the screen. And those two places are going to determine a great deal of what happens with regard to the bubonic plague. But here's the big thing. If you look at the map of Eurasia that I have up, the area that's shaded a little bit there, that's the area of present-day Mongolia. And present-day Mongolia is where the Mongol Empire kind of was founded and started. And even though that was founded back in the 1200s or late 1100s and early 1200s by Genghis Khan, that empire would rule, and I'm going to show you a map of this on the screen, would take over everything from China down to the northern part of Vietnam, all the way over like to Poland and Hungary, all the way down near Jerusalem, and take over parts of Persia. I mean, it was the largest contiguous, meaning connected, land empire ever. And the reason that matters is they tried very hard to take over coastal cities and ports because they could make some tribute and money and taxes and things like that from them. And so in the 1300s, 1343 to 1347, the Mongols, who had come all the way over to Europe, were attacking this little city down at the bottom of the Crimean Peninsula. Now, that city was a port owned by and controlled by this city, Genoa. And Genoa was very big in the Mediterranean trade, and so they had gone through this very short little straits called the Dardanelles mostly, and they have come up here and they had this fortress and this port of trade. And they traded, like with the Silk Road and things like that. Well, the Mongols wanted to stomp that down and take it over and rule it themselves, so they attacked the city. They attacked that city from 1343 to 1347, and there's a lot of that story, which I'm not going to do. What I want to do, though, is to let you know that a disease broke out during the siege and what the Mongols did. But to do that, I have to at least tell you about the disease for a moment and why it's called the Black Death and this and that. So it turns out that if you've ever been bitten by a mosquito, the mosquito lands on you, puts their little sucker into you, they spit stuff into you to keep the blood from forming scab and stuff so that they can drink your blood. And when they leave, the spit's still in you. And the spit is what makes you have that little irritation that itches. It's not from the bite of the mosquito or the little straw. It's from the junk they spit in you so they can drink your blood. Well, fleas have a similar spit. And these fleas, and I'll put this on the screen too, the name of the actual bacteria. The fleas bite into not just humans, but rats and other things. And when the fleas spit into you, it causes also an irritation, but that irritation can cause the death of a lot of your blood. And so when you die from this, you are blackened because your blood dies from this bacterial thing that the flea bit and spit into you. Now, where's that flea from? Most historians argue that it came from somewhere near Burma, Vietnam. And the Mongols did something revolutionary as to how to get that disease all the way to Europe, because Mongols rode horses. On their horses, they had little saddlebags of grains, rice, and things. And rats, being very industrious, sometimes got into those saddlebags. So the best kind of guesstimate of how it happened was Mongols invaded northern Vietnam in the area by Burma. They picked up some of these rats that had these fleas. Now, humans back then in the 1300s, 1100s, 1200s had fleas. That was not that uncommon. So fleas would be on them. Fleas would go from them to the rats, etc. But the rats that they picked up down in northern Vietnam maybe had the virus in their fleas. Those fleas were on the rats, in the saddlebags. The Mongols crossed rivers that fleas could never cross. This is so important. The Mongols got across rivers and then launched invasions of different territories and brought the fleas with them everywhere they went. Well, when they attacked Kaffa, the fleas gave that bacteria to the Mongols, and the Mongols started dying of bubonic plague and went, dang it, we have to call off our siege. This is making me so mad. So the Mongols did something kind of unique. They took a couple of the corpses of Mongols who had died of Black Death, of the bubonic plague, put them on catapults and threw them into the city of Kaffa. The Italian Genoese that saw these bodies fly over was like, well, that's kind of weird, picked the bodies up to move them and maybe bury them, and didn't realize, since everybody had fleas back then, that the fleas moved from the corpse to the person carrying the corpse, got onto those people, got onto the rats in Kaffa. The rats in Kaffa got on the ships that were parked in Kaffa. And now we have the rats as the carrier of the flea getting into the boats that the Genoese are going to take out of Kaffa. The siege ends, and so the Genoese are all very happy, and they take and fill up their boat with things to do. They went down to Constantinople, which I'll have a map up of that. They sail down there, they land there, they stay some days, because Constantinople was quite the city in the 1300s, and the rats got off, some of the fleas got off, and half of Constantinople died of the bubonic plague. But then the Genoese went everywhere. Everywhere they stopped, they dropped off. Hello rats, hello fleas. And then I'll have some maps that will show some of the ports of call of the Genoese. But the Genoese went so many places that many places got the bubonic plague. And since they didn't know it was caused by the flea that everyone seemed to be having, and they didn't really know that the rats were necessarily the carriers of many of these fleas, they didn't know how to fix it. So they did some quarantining and things, but not serious enough. So between 1347 and 1351, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people died. It is very closely and easily estimated that 1/3 of all of Europe died. 2/3 of Venice died. Half of Constantinople died, that I already said. Half of London dies. 2/3 of the people in Florence die. It is a disaster. And Europe goes through what's called the Black Death in the mid-1300s from this bacteria getting all over because of the shipping that Italian city-states were doing in the Mediterranean from the Siege of Kaffa all the way around for the next several years. One of the reasons the Black Death did so much damage was that Europeans weren't very clean. And so there were fleas, commonly. There were rats, commonly. Garbage, commonly. And yet, this is just interesting. As the Christians who were dying were very nervous that maybe they were dying because there was more than one pope at the time and some other scandalous, crazy things were going, they noticed down the road where the Jews lived that the Jews weren't dying near as much. Now, the reason the Jews weren't dying near as much is that the Jews followed a book, well, the Bible, of course, but they followed an Old Testament book called Leviticus a little bit more strenuously than Christians ever did. And there are things about cleaning in Leviticus. And so the Jews were cleaner. But they were cleaner, therefore they weren't dying of bubonic plague like so many other areas of Christians. So what did the Christians that were dying decide? Not to clean up. They didn't clean up. They didn't say, Jews, what are you doing different that we can do? They didn't do that. They blamed the Jews and said the Jews poisoned them. And then they did attacks against the Jews in which they killed many, many Jews because they blamed the Jews for the disease. The Jews didn't cause the disease. Lots of times in history, we blame things that aren't truly there, and then we do kind of vicious things. And so just to point out that Jews suffered during the bubonic plague because they were oftentimes blamed if they were near a Christian city, and that happened. Again, the bubonic plague kind of petered out after killing so many people. It is interesting to note, too, though, if we look at the big map from the beginning, the Mongols found the disease down in northern Vietnam, Burma area. They brought that disease to China, and at most accounts, 1/3 of China died of the bubonic plague, not just Europe. The bubonic plague just wiped out people across, Eurasia. The reason it didn't kill too many people in Central Asia is not very many people in Central Asia, but 1/3 of China died, 1/3 of Europe, Western Europe died, and all because of this flea that was transported across rivers and then it happened to be on the 2 bodies that they catapulted into the city when the siege didn't go their way. Just an interesting twist in history, but it changed all of history. And that's where I want to stop. Thanks so much.